The room went quiet. The second Thomas sat down. Well-dressed diners looked away. A server hesitated, and Mark didn't even try to hide his smirk as he pointed him toward the worst table in the room, right beside the kitchen door. A steak was ordered anyway. When Aaliyah set the plate down, her hand shook just enough to slip something into his palm. Mark's voice cut through the air, loud and sharp. "People like you don't belong here." Thomas unfolded the note and froze. Because Mark had just made a mistake, he wouldn't survive. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe for more powerful stories that refuse to stay silent. Aaliyah moved through the dining room with steady hands and a calm face, even though her body was already tired halfway through the shift. She had learned how to carry herself that way, upright, controlled, invisible when necessary. In a place like this, dignity wasn't given. It had to be protected. Every plate she carried felt heavier, knowing one mistake could cost her hours, tips, or worse. That pressure followed her everywhere, all the way home to Jaden, whose life depended on her showing up every day no matter how she felt. Aaliyah Brooks didn't have the luxury of bad days. The restaurant sold an image of perfection. White tablecloths, soft lighting, guests who spoke confidently about money and influence. But beneath that shine, the rules were different for different people. Aaliyah felt it in the way conversations stopped when she passed, in the way her work was watched more closely, in the way authority always leaned in one direction. Mark Reynolds ran the floor with a smile that never reached his eyes. His approval came easily to some and never at all to others. From his corner table, Thomas watched quietly. He said little, asked for nothing extra, and waited. Years of building power had taught him how to read rooms, and this one felt wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, just controlled in a way that pressed down on certain people harder than others. He noticed how Aaliyah worked twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, how Mark spoke to her differently than the rest. Thomas Keller had come looking for answers, but he hadn't expected the tension to feel this personal. In the kitchen, pressure moved just as quietly. Ethan Moore followed orders without looking up, reminding himself why he needed this job, why mistakes weren't an option. Everyone here knew where the power sat, and no one questioned it out loud. That silence was part of the system, and watching it all unfold, unseen for now, was Lauren Mitchell. Close enough to step in, far enough to let the truth surface on its own. Nothing had exploded yet, no voices raised, no scene made, but the air had shifted, and everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, could feel that what started tonight wouldn't end quietly. The tension didn't disappear after the plate touched the table. It thickened, settling into the space like pressure waiting to snap. Aaliyah moved carefully now, every step measured, every motion watched. She had worked long enough to know when attention shifted from service to suspicion. This was no longer about a mistake. It was about control. Aaliyah Brooks kept her face calm, even as her chest tightened, because losing composure in a place like this was treated like guilt. Mark Reynolds didn't need to raise his voice to dominate the room. He let silence do the work. A pause here, a glance there, authority wrapped in routine. Servers noticed, guests noticed. No one intervened. The system functioned best when everyone played their part and pretended not to see who it crushed. Behind the kitchen doors, the line was crossed quietly. Mark Reynolds stepped in with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. He pointed toward the prep station, his tone low but unmistakable. "Use the old cut, the one we pulled yesterday. If he wants to sit here looking like that, let him feel it." Ethan Moore froze. He knew exactly what was being asked. The meat had been left out too long, flagged for disposal, dangerous enough to make someone seriously ill. This wasn't about sending a message anymore. This was harm disguised as policy. "That's not safe. We're not supposed to use that one," Ethan said, his voice barely steady. Mark's expression hardened, impatience slipping through the mask. "Do what you're told, or explain to your family why you don't have this job tomorrow." The words landed heavier than shouting. No one else spoke. No one objected. The silence around Ethan Moore sealed the decision, not because it was right, but because survival demanded it. Guilt settled in his chest, sharp and relentless. As Aaliyah passed the service window with a tray of glasses, the conversation reached her in fragments. Not every word. Enough. Enough to understand that this wasn't cruelty born of arrogance alone. It was deliberate, calculated. She kept walking, heart racing, knowing that once you heard something like that, you couldn't unknow it. Aaliyah Brooks thought of Jaden Brooks waiting at home, trusting her to come back with the world still standing. That thought steadied her hands. Fear didn't vanish, but it stopped being a reason to stay quiet. On the dining floor, Mark Reynolds followed her path with deliberate timing. He stopped just close enough for others to notice, his voice calm but sharp. "Finish your section and stay where you belong." Aaliyah didn't respond. She didn't need to. The message was meant for everyone watching. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. No one spoke up. Complicity didn't always sound like agreement. Sometimes it sounded like silence. At the corner table, Thomas Keller observed everything. He didn't rush. He didn't react. Years of navigating systems built on power imbalance had taught him patience, the untouched steak, the way Mark's attention lingered on the person who served it, the subtle escalation. The folded note in his pocket confirmed what his instincts already knew. This wasn't mismanagement. It was intent. When Mark glanced toward him again, irritation sharpening into something reckless, Thomas Keller met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not finished," he said evenly. The words unsettled Mark Reynolds more than anger ever could. He turned away quickly, mistaking restraint for control. The room resumed its low murmur, as if nothing had happened, but the air had shifted. What felt routine moments ago now felt dangerous. In the kitchen, Ethan Moore moved mechanically, hands unsteady, mind racing. He knew the longer this continued, the worse it would become. He told himself this was how systems survived, by forcing people to choose between harm and hunger. But the choice had already been made, and it burned. Near the entrance, Lauren Mitchell stood still, unnoticed, absorbing every detail. Lauren Mitchell understood timing. Intervention too early would scatter the truth. Waiting allowed it to reveal itself. The behavior, the threats, the silence. It was all unfolding exactly as it needed to. The stake remained untouched. Mark Reynolds pressed forward, convinced authority would protect him. But beneath the surface, fear was spreading, quietly, unevenly, among those who understood what had crossed the line. Nothing had broken open yet, no reveal, no rescue. Just anger building, layered with silence, pulling the room closer to a moment that would expose how fragile power becomes once truth refuses to stay hidden. The tension finally broke when Mark stepped forward, no longer pretending restraint. His confidence hardened into cruelty, sharpened by the belief that authority would protect him, no matter how ugly things became. He stopped beside Aaliyah, close enough to make the moment public, deliberate enough to send a message to everyone watching. "You're done here. Hand in your apron and don't come back," Mark said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The room stiffened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Aaliyah Brooks didn't move. Her chest tightened, but her posture stayed steady. She had known this was coming the moment she chose to act. Losing this job meant uncertainty, fear, and explaining everything to Jaden Brooks when she got home. But backing down now would erase the reason she'd taken the risk in the first place. Thomas watched the exchange without flinching. Thomas Keller rose slowly from his chair, not in anger, not in haste, but with a calm that shifted the air around him. He stepped just far enough forward to place himself between authority and abuse. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said evenly. Mark turned on him, irritation flashing across his face. To him, this was still a problem he could manage, a disruption he could silence. "Sit down." "This doesn't concern you," Mark snapped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the balance began to tilt. Lauren Mitchell stepped into view near the entrance, her presence cutting through the noise like a blade. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't interrupted. She had waited until the truth stood exposed and undeniable. Her voice carried without effort. "It concerns us. I'm here on behalf of the owner, and this conversation is being documented," Lauren said. The shift was immediate. Faces changed. Postures stiffened. Mark Reynolds felt it before he understood it. The sudden awareness that the room was no longer under his control. His confidence faltered, replaced by a tight, calculating panic. Lauren gestured toward the kitchen entrance, where Ethan Moore stood frozen. Ethan had tried to disappear into the background, but guilt had followed him all night, growing heavier with every second of silence. Now, with nowhere left to hide, he stepped forward. His voice shook, but it didn't break. "He told me to use the meat that was supposed to be thrown out. He said no one would believe him if he got sick," Ethan said. The words hit the room like a shockwave. Chairs scraped back. A few diners pushed their plates away. Mark's face drained of color as the story he thought he controlled unraveled in front of witnesses. Only now did the power truly shift. Thomas Keller reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the table, screen facing up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. Mark backed away a step, his authority collapsing into desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, the confidence gone, replaced by fear. But everyone else understood exactly what was happening. The silence that followed wasn't passive anymore. It was charged. Mark Reynolds had built his control on the assumption that no one would challenge him, that fear and routine would keep the system intact. That assumption had just shattered. Security moved closer. Phones came out. Eyes stayed fixed on him. Aaliyah Brooks stood still, heart pounding, as the reality settled in. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't alone. The risk she'd taken had changed the direction of the room, and there was no undoing it now. Thomas Keller looked around once, taking in the faces, the shock, the realization. What had started as humiliation had become exposure. What had been quiet cruelty was now public truth. The night hadn't ended yet. Consequences were still coming. But the moment had arrived. The one Mark could never recover from. Power had shifted, not because it was granted, but because it had been stripped away. And as the room held its breath, it became clear that nothing here would return to the way it was before. The fallout came fast, and it was permanent. Mark Reynolds was escorted out of the restaurant that same night, his authority stripped in front of the very people he had spent years intimidating into silence. An internal investigation began immediately, followed by a formal report to health regulators and corporate compliance. The attempt to serve contaminated food, the documented threats, the pattern of targeting, none of it could be explained away. By morning, his access was revoked. By the end of the week, his name was removed from every system that once protected him. There was no quiet transfer, no soft landing. The power he relied on vanished the moment the truth became public. Aaliyah Brooks didn't leave in shame. She left with her head high. What she had done was no longer whispered or questioned. It was recognized. Her actions were documented, validated, and defended. For the first time in that space, she wasn't treated as replaceable. She was treated as essential. The job she nearly lost became the proof that dignity, when defended, can force systems to change. Ethan Moore gave a full statement that night. The fear that had kept him silent didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. His cooperation protected him from retaliation and exposed how often survival is used as leverage against conscience. He wasn't praised as a hero, but he was no longer invisible. Accountability didn't crush him. It freed him. Lauren Mitchell ensured the process didn't stall or soften. Policies were enforced. Safeguards were put in writing. What happened was not framed as a misunderstanding, but as misconduct with consequences. The system was forced to look at itself. Thomas Keller didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. The changes spoke for him. New oversight. Clear reporting paths. Zero tolerance written into action. What mattered most wasn't that he had power, but that he used it to protect those who were punished for doing the right thing. When Aaliyah returned home, Jaden Brooks noticed the difference before she said a word. The weight she carried every night wasn't gone, but it was lighter. The fear had been replaced with something unfamiliar but real: belief. This wasn't just one moment in one restaurant. It was a reminder of how often racism hides behind routine, how easily silence becomes complicity, and how much risk is placed on those with the least protection. Change didn't come from comfort. It came because someone refused to look away. The question now isn't whether injustice exists. It's how many people are still being told to stay in their place, and who will choose to speak next. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more stories about truth, justice, and the fight to be seen.